So this is the last lecture for this course, and a little different perhaps from the previous lectures. Instead of focusing now on an author that might represent or not a social movement, we are going to talk on this lecture about a social movement, a Mexican. Well, I shouldn't say Mexican because it's debatable whether they are only Mexican, but it's a group of indigenous people that reside in the southern area of Mexico. They've been together since 1994, this political group, and they started their work with indigenous people, a very diverse group of indigenous people that reside in the area of Chiapas. So we call them Zapatistas, and their logo is peace with dignity and respect. I'm interested in this movement because I feel that somehow it pulls together many of the different readings that we've had and the different theories that we've been looking at. I think it draws both from Marxism and anarchism, and even some notions of liberalism are in there. I think they also take a lot out of thinkers like Gloria Anzaldúa, and even thinkers like Malcolm X, and very much from Nietzsche, believe it or not, not directly from Nietzsche perhaps, but through the work of Michel Foucault, who somehow comes and introduces a lot of modifications into social theory, making a big thing about the need to diversify the struggles and to understand that capitalism operates on us as subjects of this power, and not just through the economics of it, but also through our cultural traits, the way that we think about gender, sexuality, that nations are built on this capacity that states have to control all of our energies, not just the possibility of us to go to work for a corporation or for ourselves, but also how we marry, who we can marry, who we cannot marry, what's good for the children, what's not good for the children. All of that stuff comes into play when you think about how you build power. So I use the example of the Zapatistas in Chiapas as a way of trying to pull together many of the different things that we've been thinking out throughout the course. So a film that I would recommend, Zapatista by Big Noise Film. Great film about the Zapatistas uprising early on. So you're not going to see much of the development. They're mostly looking at what happened, what led them to have a successful insurrection. So we hear for the first time as a public about the Zapatistas on January 1st, 1994. They had been organizing this political group for over 10 years, but it was all underground, and we only hear about them when they take over several towns in Chiapas, including the capital city of this Mexican state. It's the biggest state in Mexico, by the way, and they control over 40% of it. So they take over San Cristóbal de las Casas, Ocosingo, Las Margaritas, and other towns in the area. They liberate all the prisoners. They set fire to the police station and to army garrisons as a way of stopping the army and the police from repressing them. You should know that there have been many, many indigenous insurrections in Mexico, and all of them were repressed by the state before we could even hear about them. So this is a very unusual situation that we see in 1994. It was scheduled on that day because that's the day that the NAFTA, this free trade agreement that Trump hates, went into effect. While the corporations of Mexico or the Mexican located corporations were interested in NAFTA. NAFTA was actually a disaster, especially for the campesinos, for the people who work the fields in Mexico. And the Zapatistas, as I mentioned, is a group of political people that came into contact with these indigenous folks, most of them Mayans. So this NAFTA agreement was a terrible thing for them, and they protest that by taking over all of these towns. Now, the most interesting thing for me of this successful uprising is the fact that we found out about what was going on that same day, even those of us who had never heard about them. And this includes myself. I was an activist and an organizer in social movements for a long time, so I have plenty of contacts with people all over the world who are interested in social change, but I had never heard of the Zapatistas themselves. But that morning when I woke up, I found an email in my inbox that told me that a group of indigenous people had taken over the capital city of Chiapas, and they were trying to avoid heavy repression if I could please contact the president of the country, and a number of other phone numbers and contacts that were made available to me. This, in my view, made a whole difference with the way that the government was able to deal with them. They were heavily repressed, but the Catholic Church in the area, a progressive Catholic Church that we think of as Third World Theology Church, they were able to enact a ceasefire with the state. And this was just because there was so much international pressure immediately after the uprising. So this is a characteristic of this, what we call this postmodern revolution, that they do not only rely on their own local forces, but they were very well organized ahead of time to create a social global network of solidarity. If you think of globalization and how it affects populations throughout the world in different countries, sometimes the same ethnicity is exploited in sweatshops in China, for example, and in sweatshops in the United States. The fact that this political group of indigenous people were able to come up with a way of insurrecting that took into account globalization and put pressure on this country through a global network is just something that you have to admire the genius of them. So more information on NAFTA. If you click on that link that I put up in the PowerPoint, you'll see more information about this trade agreement that was so bad for the mostly for the not only the working class people, but mostly for the people who work the fields in Mexico. So what happened immediately after the initial uprising? From January 2 to 12, the National Army moved in with helicopters and heavy artillery, and the Zapatistas have to retreat to the jungle, and they suffer heavy losses. So when you watch those videos, beware that you will see indigenous people's bodies there and some horrendous images of death. But as I mentioned before, the Theology Liberation Bishop Samuel Ruiz is able to negotiate a ceasefire against the background of this enormous international pressure that had been put in place ahead of time. So the Zapatistas, through this negotiation and this resistance to these 2 days of heavy repression, are able to retain the liberated land, which is, as I said, most of the territory of the biggest state in Mexico. So a year later, in 95, the army breaks a ceasefire and attacks the Zapatista villages. And again, the Zapatistas have to run into the jungle, abandon their villages, and just survive there best they can. But the military is not able to seize the main leaders of the organization, so the insurrection continues, and eventually the ECNL, in order to stop this constant harassment from the state of Mexico, starts organizing what they call the international encuentros in the jungle. So this gave rise to the People's Global Action Network, the PGA, which is a group of groups of many anarchists, autonomists, and Marxists around the world, organizers who are interested in a different way of globalizing the world that is not necessarily built on the backs of people who cannot do otherwise, like the people who work the lands of Mexico, or like the immigrants that we see drowning every day in the Mediterranean Sea. So they are looking for a way of globalizing the world that is not just good for corporations, but it's actually good for the majority of the people, for the 99%. Jumping ahead, in the year 2000, the Zapatistas realized that they have two ongoing problems, and both of them are connected with issues of power. We looked at the insurrections of Cuba, and we looked at the calls of Marx, and we must have noticed that these are calls for centralized kind of governance with a strong political party, with leadership and a vanguard that is highly educated and makes decisions for the masses of people in the country that made the revolution, until supposedly these masses grow out of their education under capitalism and are able to develop a new subjectivity that will be the subjectivity that will uphold these revolutionary communities, a subjectivity that necessarily needs to leave aside any kind of self-interest and just work for the interest of the community. So, because that takes a long time, these vanguards of highly educated people in political parties usually do the thinking and the ruling for these folks. And that, as we've seen in the Soviet Union and also up to a certain point in Cuba, doesn't always end up in the best possible way. So the Zapatistas realized that the army, where most of the intellectuals of this revolution are active in, is having a lot of power over the campesinos in the communities, over the poor indigenous people that constitute their territory, their base, if you want. So they decide to implement governments that are only civilian so that they can counter attack the power of the Zapatista army over the communities. This is another reason why we call it a postmodern revolution, because they are dealing with the issue of power, trying to decentralize this power structure in order to avoid the bureaucratization and ultimately exploitation by the bureaucracy in Russia, for example, in the Soviet Union, against their own people. So they established these autonomous governments, but also thinking of the many problems that bureaucracies generated in the communist countries. They set up a system that these governments don't last in power more than 2 weeks. So there's a constant renewal of these governments, and people are not paid to be in those positions. So they really want to go back home and take care of their lands rather than be in government, which solves the issue of, that we see in Western democracies, where we elect somebody into power and then they do whatever they want in Washington, and we never hear about them until the next election. So this is a way that they dealt with that situation. The other reason why they create all these autonomous communities and governments is because they want to be able to distribute the international support that they receive from many NGOs in Europe and the United States and other countries of the world, so that it's evenly distributed amongst the communities. Otherwise, before, people with a lot of power and money would make friends with certain communities, and these communities would get a lot of support, but then the communities down the road that were also Zapatistas and also indigenous would starve. So by creating these autonomous governments, they are able to distribute resources that come from abroad in a more equitable way and create less frictions amongst the communities, and also put a stop to the power of the intellectually powerful army that they created. Also in this year, the year 2000, they write the Sixth Declaration of the Lacandon-Django, calling for a broad coalition, a broad global coalition, again, because they are very aware that during times like this, where globalization is so important, you cannot pretend that you're going to be able to hold on to power on your own. You need a global coalition. And they call for this global coalition to be established by people that are to the left and from the ground up. We'll talk more about that later. And you have, as part of your assigned readings for this class, this declaration of the Lacandon-Django. Chiapas in context, so that we get an idea why these people uprose. It's the largest indigenous population in Mexico, is located in the states. in the state of Chiapas, but it's also the population, and not surprisingly, because they are mostly indigenous and thus have been deprived from their own resources, where they have the highest rates of congenital malnutrition, infant and adult mortality of all of Mexico. Also, very high rates of illiteracy, and things that are really heartbreaking and hard to believe. The life expectancy in these indigenous communities is 44 years versus 70 years, which is the national average for Mexico outside of indigenous communities. Brutal, right? 44 years old, I'm 58. That means that if I had been born in Chiapas, I would be dead now. So very powerful numbers, right? Also, 159 babies died, over 1,000 babies born, while in the rest of Mexico, it's 45 over 1,000. And finally, not surprisingly again, because women are usually at the bottom of this brutality chains, half of the population was malnourished at the time that they took over, and the girls being the most affected. And this is the part that I'm saying. It's not surprising because in general, women are always more oppressed than men. Very interesting stuff to watch. Zapatista women, a very interesting short video about them. It's a little childish, the presentation, I could say, because it's meant as an educational resource for children and not for adults, but I think it's worth watching. So another reason why we call this a post-structural, postmodern revolution is because it's what we consider an autonomous movement, very different, although Marxist-oriented, very different from the movements that we saw, for example, the Che Guevara lead. These folks are not aimed at state power. They are not interested in taking over the central government of Mexico like Che Guevara and his friends did with the central power in Cuba. They just think that the state does not serve them, that the state has abandoned the indigenous, so the indigenous should abandon the state of Mexico. So what they did is they created these autonomous communities that have self-governments and popular participation. And as I said, the governments are renewed every 2 weeks, so there's no issue there of bureaucracy. They also employ other ways of listening to their people. One of this is called lead by obeying. That means that the leadership is in the hands of folks who have been there for a long time and have been studying, Marx and all the other important authors that made a dent in the way that we think about social change. But at the same time, they pay very close attention to the desires of the community, which is something that was not present in the Soviet Union or Cuba because of this idea that people at the bottom, people in the working class, usually until they've been able to live in a non-capitalist society, have the values and the interests of capitalism and not of communism or socialism. So these folks have a very different approach to that. They do realize that probably some of these ideas in the communities do stem from the hegemony of capitalist ideas in the world in general, but that there's also knowledge there. These are people that have been able to survive for over 500 years the exploitation of white corporations. So they listen. That's what they mean by lead by obeying. And something important for what we study in this course is that they've been able to challenge, or I think they did, the slave master dynamics that we mentioned in the Nietzsche classes. They do uphold perspectivism. They have this really long decision-making processes. They lead by obeying. They try to avoid the creation of super people, of vanguards, of folks that are, not the regular, real, everyday folks, but just create a community that will be strong and with values that they can all share. So by rotating their government every 2 weeks, they are making a huge effort here to try to stay out of this slave master dynamics so that most people in the community would be empowered rather than a few over the many. So this connects with lead by obeying, and it connects with the idea of autonomy and governance and popular participation. And it does connect, in my perspective, with Marx's original ideas. While Marx talked about the dictatorship of the proletariat, as I mentioned, he also thought that Western democracies, like what we know now, were dictatorships of the bourgeois. So I think that Marx's ideas for a society that would be free and where human beings could be free and be able to become what they could is not something that is completely against these ideas of the Zapatistas, but it is very different from the conceptions of Che Guevara and other folks that we haven't studied, like Lenin in the Soviet Union, for example, the first revolutionary in the Soviet Union in 1917. So we call it the first postmodern, post-colonial revolution, as I said, and this is where I think Marxism meets the over person, no, right? This idea of Nietzsche, of somebody who will strive to be a better person without oppressing others, and at the same time somebody who understands that the economy is important, but not the only piece in the construction of power. So they hold what we call a community-oriented subjectivity. As I mentioned in other classes, subjectivity is different from identity in the sense that we understand, those of us who use the concept of subjectivity, we understand that it's less of a fixed deal. A subjectivity is what we develop in our dance with the state, in our dance with power in general, and it can be changed and it can be modified. So this is the project of the Zapatistas, is creating this community-oriented subjectivity based on Marxism, yes, but also on this indigenous knowledge that the people of Chiapas have held for generations. So we see this as the result of a symbiosis of indigenous culture and what I call, and many call, post-structural Marxism. This Marxism that has been strongly influenced by Michel Foucault and by other authors. Some contemporary examples of post-structural Marxist authors, aside from the Zapatistas, who do publish books, and I would encourage you to read more than what I assign if you're interested. One very famous one is Silvia Federici. Silvia Federici, the author of Caliban and the Witch. She's a post-structural Marxist, and she's somebody who supports very much the idea of revolutions like the Zapatistas have done in Mexico. So their interest is to create a world where there's the possibility of having many diverse ways of being in the world, and not just one way of being in the world. But again, this is always against the background of oppression. They do call for diversity, but they call from diversity from the ground up and to the left. So they wouldn't be interested in a diversity that would mean, for example, expressions of white supremacy. They wouldn't consider this a kind of diversity that would help them build this new power that they're working on. So something that we usually don't mention very emphatically is that liberation theology, this Catholic trend within Catholicism that really works with people who are poor and dispossessed, has a huge impact on the way that the Zapatistas organize. And I think there's almost like a dual power in the communities that you feel if you visit there and you stay there for a while. I visited the Zapatistas communities in 2003, I think, or 2004, I can't remember. But I didn't stay long enough there to watch these dynamics, but I talked and read from other people who were able to stay there for a longer time. And it seems like the village folks, the campesinos, the people who are less politically oriented, are very much influenced by Catholicism in the figure of liberation theology. while people who are more radical tend to join the Zapatista army, where the intellectuals that came from Mexico City are active. There are obviously lots of indigenous people in the army as well, but mostly it's those indigenous people that are interested in less interested in religion and more interested in issues of power and organization. So liberation theology stems from the days of Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, who was one of the first Catholic priests to arrive to the New World, as they call it, to the Americas, and he has been credited for being one of the few, if not the only, part of the colonizers who called for the end to the enslavement of the indigenous people. His argument was that the indigenous people were not able to hold this kind of brutality, and which is true because they were dying brutally. But unfortunately, he also recommended that people from Africa were brought in to be slaves, since they were able to do those jobs and sustain that kind of brutality against them. It is said that Bartolomé de las Casas changed his mind later, but there's not as much evidence of that as there is of his distinction between the indigenous and people from Africa. The Zapatistas function mostly through the solidarity economy, and this means that the surplus value that Marx identified as that difference between what the worker takes home and what the worker produces, this surplus value stays within the community, not necessarily in people's pockets because they don't use cash, they don't use money, but they do keep the surplus value in the community. We think that they co-created the anti-corporate globalization movement. You might have heard about us. I was very involved in that movement. I created many of the giant puppets that you see on the protests at the time. That movement came to an end in 2003, and it began after the Zapatistas because of the impulse that the Zapatistas gave us. And it was very important in the United States. We did a lot of try to raise awareness around trade agreements like NAFTA and other international trade agreements that were very bad for the working people in the United States. As we see now, out of those trade agreements is that we've had all this outsourcing that left our working class without jobs. So this was one of their big, important contributions to social change. They also received a lot of support from Western activists against state repression in Mexico, and their workshops, because of these connections that they have internationally, are able to work outside of capitalist relations of production. That means that they don't have a boss, they don't have somebody who extracts surplus value from them, but they work in solidarity with each other through a very different way of organizing. You can see examples of this in different parts of the world, not necessarily in autonomous communities as big and developed as Chiapas, but in Argentina, for example, where STEPIC organizes a semester abroad, you can go and do an internship in factories that were taken over by workers in the year 2001, when the economy collapsed and many factories were being fraudulently bankrupted. The workers took them over, and they're still producing. They're selling for the market, only that now they are workers' co-op and there's no corporate money involved in the organization anymore. It was such a big deal that the government, and I'm still talking about Argentina, about the recovered factories in Argentina, the government bought the factories from the owners, paid them back, and the workers are buying the factory from the state in small installments. These are different ways of thinking about production and the economy, and we call this sometimes a solidarity economy because its projects are supported by organizations throughout the world that are more interested in having sustainable global trade rather than the so-called free trade that actually oppresses those who really have no freedom, like folks who work the land in Chiapas. important concepts that the Zapatistas use: walking questioning. Instead of offering answers, they rather question and ask questions from the people that they work with in order to have the more nuanced vision of what's going on. They say that answers usually reproduce power domination, this idea that I was talking about before, the vanguard, right? The vanguard that knows best, which will tell you what to do in Cuba, for example, but sometimes, that doesn't work quite well, and people remain with a different kind of subjectivity while the vanguard advances on its own. So this is a situation of power domination over folks who you are supposed to bring up to your own status. In reality, it doesn't happen all that much. So that's why they call for a coalition from the grass up and to the left, in the sense that it doesn't come from above, from the intellectuals, from the middle class people that know better, but comes from the community itself, and to the left in the sense that, yes, they are very clear about what they want. They don't want to reproduce capitalism. That's not something that is good for indigenous poor people. They want to have a coalition that works with ideas that are somewhat based on Marxism, but not necessarily in an oppressive kind of Marxism. So because of this idea of forming coalitions from the grass up and to the left, they call for all who are oppressed by bad governments to join them. They consider bad governments pretty much all the governments in the world, except these good governments that they set up, which are these governments that are renewable every 2 weeks and are composed of indigenous people who are working their own lands, both women and men. So I'm not going to read all of this, but the situation of the women in Chiapas has improved tremendously under capitalism. Their situation was so brutal that if you read carefully all these laws that they put together after the uprising, it breaks your heart what they tell us of what their lives were like. For example, one of the points is women have the right to be free of violence from both relatives and strangers. Women have the right to choose their partner and are not obliged to enter into marriage. Women should be able to have all the children they decide to have. So evidently, there was a situation of brutal disempowerment of women, of brutal oppression of women, which the Zapatistas are making a huge effort to overcome. It doesn't happen all the time for them. There's still a lot of pullback, but they have been able to empower many women. One of the issues that they have in the communities is that the women who are most radical tend to join the army and do not stay in the communities. So people who stay in the communities are a little less radical, which makes the work of women's empowerment a little slower. There are many people in Chiapas and other places of the world studying the case of the women of Chiapas. Marga Milian has written wonderful work on their lives. If you're interested, shoot me an email and I'll send you her work. Some of it has been translated into English. So the juntas de buen gobierno, I've gone through it a little bit already. They are the campesinos themselves. They rotate every 2 weeks. There's both men and women in it. And I emphasize this because in the past there wouldn't have been any women in it since women were so oppressed. They were established to redistribute resources and to counterpower the power of the army. They I don't know, I always need to introduce like the critique, right? When I visited there, I was very surprised to see that there were crates and crates and crates of Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola, I don't know what it means for people here in the United States other than a drink, but in Latin America, it's a terrible thing. In countries like Guatemala, for example, the Coca-Cola corporations does not allow for workers to unionize, and they routinely kill union leaders. There's even songs about it, websites that call about Coca-Cola's death squads, etc. So why would the Zapatistas drink this? It's really one of those things that you say, well, how does that connect with autonomy? I think the reason is because they don't allow for people to drink alcohol in the communities. That was one of the things that the women of Chiapas really wanted to stop, was the alcoholism in the communities, because they noticed that they were more, even worse, their abuse increased if men were drunk. So they cannot buy alcohol in the community. So I think that you gotta give them something, right? If you don't drink alcohol, are you only going to drink water? So many activists against Coca-Cola have talked with the Zapatistas and have tried to get them to change this. And one of them went and talked with Marcos. Marcos is one of the most renowned leaders of the Zapatistas. He has penned many of their books. He's one of the spokespeople for them. And Marcos said, well, okay, we got the issue, we understand what the problem is, and we have the solution. So this activist asked him, well, what is the solution? And he said, we are going to drink it all. Anyway, Coca-Cola aside, the Zapatistas are still the object of lots of violence by the state and paramilitaries. In 2014, one of their schools was attacked and one of their teachers was killed, just to give you an example. So they are still very much on the edge of everything, but they have been able to exist since 1994 as over the ground, above ground revolutionary movement, and they've been very successful. This is a mural from one of the schools of the Zapatistas, and it's very important that it's a woman who's reading this book, because women were not educated in the past before the uprising. The book says, autonomous education builds different worlds where many worlds can fit with very many different truths.